Hello, my name is Alan Hepburn, and today we're going to be talking about a subject that will primarily be of interest to IFR pilots, a change in the Canadian requirements for getting an instrument rating that came on the scene back in 2017. The requirement to fly a continuous descent profile on non-precision approaches. Here's an extract from the flight test guide. We'll look at it more closely in a minute. Despite the 5 years that have gone by, there's still a lack of guidance on how these techniques are to be applied. Before we get into that, however, I'll make some general observations on changes that have had a profound effect on the IFR system in recent years. I did a count of IFR approaches in Ontario in July 2022. And in the province, there were 102 airports with RNAV approach procedures, 11 with VOR-DME, 7 with NDB, and 14 with ILS. There are no IFR airports left in Ontario where there isn't an RNAV approach. No doubt the other provinces are similar. What this says to me is that flying IFR in Canada has become primarily an RNAV operation. If you're not convinced, take a look at this picture of the US IFR low chart for the airspace between Toronto and Montreal. I've used the US chart because the Tango Route's RNAV airways are shown in blue, whereas the Victor airways are shown in black. Not much black around. The aircraft is assumed to have dual C-146 compliant GPS navigators. Without two, in many areas, you won't meet CARS 605.18J, which pertains to equipment redundancy. With two, you're legal anywhere in Canada without any other navigation equipment. If the GPS is not C-146 compliant, it's only approved for supplemental navigation, and since we're already at the point where the traditional aid system no longer provides adequate primary navigation coverage, there's often nothing for a non-C-146 navigator to supplement. While using continuous descent techniques also applies to traditional aids approaches, I'll be talking initially about RNAV approaches. Here's what the flight test guide has to say about CDFA. If you use the old step-down techniques, also known as dive and drive, on your IFR flight test or pilot competency check, you will be considered to have made a major error. We don't want that. The words here are a little vague as to which segments of the approach procedure require CDFA. Here's their definition of CDFA. It's quite clear here that CDFA is to be used, quote, for flying the final approach segment from an initial altitude at or above the final approach fix altitude, end quote. I interpret this to mean that you have to be stabilized by the time you cross the FAF. It takes about 2 miles to get stabilized, so you should start down around 2 miles before the FAF or further back. When using CDFA, after you initiate the final descent, you fly a stabilized approach, details of that on the next slide, all the way until you start the flare. If you reach the minimum descent altitude and don't see the runway, you start the missed approach right away. There's no leveling off until you pass the missed approach waypoint. CDFA only applies to non-precision approaches, so we'll forget about ILS approaches and RNAV approaches with approved vertical guidance, that is, to LPV minimums. The latter apparently don't meet the ICAO definition of precision approaches, but for the purposes of the IFR flight test, they are considered to do so. Here's the definition of a stabilized approach. Basically, everything has to be set up and all checks complete, and the descent has to be stable within these defined limits before you can declare the approach stabilized. Once you are stabilized, only minor control inputs should be required. If anything exceeds these limits after you're stabilized, you go missed. The transition from level flight to a stabilized descent is not instantaneous, so you have to allow a mile or two after the descent is initiated before it can be said to be stabilized. For a typical 3-degree slope, 2 miles is equivalent to about 650 feet. So that 1,000 foot above ground level requirement would have you start your descent at 1,650 feet above ground level or higher. My earlier interpretation of starting down 2 miles before the FAF often puts the top of descent higher than this, but that just makes things a little less hurried, so I'll stick with it. The idea is to minimize the workload and to have nothing to distract you to the extent that you fly into the ground during the critical final approach phase. The main reason for introducing CDFA was to reduce the number of controlled flight into terrain accidents. This RNAV approach to runway 26 at Kirkland Lake is a typical RNAV approach. This one is simpler than most, since it only has LNAV minimums and no step-down fix after the FAF. Unlike US charts, Canadian ones now support CDFA by including a CDFA table that shows the height of the glide path versus the distance from the missed approach point. The primary use of the CDFA table is to help you pick your top of descent point where you will start your CDFA. In a non-radar environment, you have to transition via one of the published initial approach fixes, VASNA, AGMED, or SASUL in this case. Once you've been cleared for the approach and are within 25 miles of the fix specified in the 25-mile safe altitude designator, you can come down to the specified sector safety altitude. In cold weather, this and all subsequent altitudes are supposed to be corrected for temperature. More on this later. Also note that, fairly recently, circling minimums were removed from the majority of RNAV approach procedures. Since most runways now have approaches to both ends, it's now considered safer to shoot the approach for the reciprocal runway. That's no doubt true, because the circling approach in minimums weather is about the most dangerous thing you can legally do in IFR. For most RNAV approaches, the C146 compliant navigator will present you with advisory vertical guidance, which you and/or your autopilot can follow down to the MDA. This greatly simplifies CDFA, since you have graphic vertical guidance even though it's not approved. Once you've intercepted the glide path, you just need to keep the glide path needle centered. Without vertical guidance, you have nothing to go by other than the vertical speed read from a table on the instrument approach chart. I've been unable to establish what, if any, relationship there is between the CDFA table slope and the advisory vertical guidance slope in Canada. It seems likely that they are the same, but it is certainly true that you can get advisory vertical guidance even when the CDFA table is empty. The advisory vertical guidance is a creation of Garmin-Jeppesen, so NAV Canada doesn't know this information to put in their charts. We'll talk a little more about this in Part 3 under US differences, because the situation south of the border is a bit different from here. Once you start your final descent, however, graphic vertical guidance is so convenient that you may be tempted to ignore the numeric data. Just remember that the graphic guidance is advisory, but the published minimums are mandatory, so do make sure it doesn't guide you below these published minimums. When you're presented with the list of procedures, those offering advisory vertical guidance will have LNAV plus V appended to the name on Garmin equipment. For advisory vertical guidance to be offered, two things have to be true. The information on the slope has to be in the navigator's database, and the WAS signal has to pass an integrity check. If either of these checks fail, you will only see RNAV, no plus V. The integrity check is done in real time, so you can't be sure it will be met until you load the approach. But if you want some advance warning of lack of vertical guidance, advisory or approved, just try loading the approaches you might expect at your destination well ahead of time. Other than in the extreme north of the country, where WAS reception may be intermittent, if you see RNAV plus V once, you should get it again later. But don't rely on this on the ground. WAS may not be available there, particularly soon after you turn the navigator on, or if there is not a good view of the southern sky. Of course, you have to be cleared for the approach, but you also have to respect the 125-mile minimum safe altitudes. Once the approach is loaded, you can check your distance from the missed approach waypoint by touching it on the map. The distance is shown in the pan view information. This feature is useful to determine when you're close enough to start down to the minimum safe altitude. The Garmin 400-500 series equipment has similar capability, though the print is so small it's almost unusable. I'll show you another way to handle this using GPS number 2 in the airborne demonstration. Here's the CDFA table for the RNAV 26 approach at Kirkland Lake. As part of your pre-approach briefing, you should use the CDFA table to select your top of descent altitude and distance. You should do this whether you expect advisory vertical guidance or not. The only difference will be that, with advisory vertical guidance, you'll start the final descent when the needle centers. Without it, you'll start down when you reach your selected distance back from the missed approach point. The maximum gradient for which NAV Canada populates this table is 3.5 degrees, which works out at 370 feet per mile. There is a top of descent altitude recommended on the instrument approach procedure. It's the number without minimum or maximum bars, 2,700 feet in this case. It's usually the highest of the published transition altitudes, but it's not necessarily what I'd recommend. In this case, 2,700 feet would put the top of descent much closer to the FAF than my proposed 2 miles. If we can start down at or above the minimum sector safe altitude, 2,900 feet in this case, we can get by with a single descent. 3,100 feet is covered in the CDFA table at 6 miles and would give 1.9 miles to get stabilized, so that would work nicely. A second table at the bottom left of the chart lists your target vertical speed against ground speed. The only mandatory height requirement is not to bust minimums, and adherence to the published slope heights at the step-down fixes should assure this. But there's no guarantee that advisory vertical guidance won't take you lower. So check your height as you approach each step-down fix. But don't attempt to check it against the CDFA table every mile. The idea is to decrease workload, not increase it. Here's the RNAV runway 06 at Saint-Jean, Quebec, where a 2-stage descent would be required. The sector safe altitude of 3,500 feet is not on the CDFA table, so you're going to have to make an initial descent to your chosen top of descent altitude when you cross the initial approach fix. Then level off and commence your final descent when you reach your top of descent point on the final approach. If we want 2 miles to get stabilized, our top of descent will have to be at least a 6-mile, 2,100 foot point on the glide path, not the recommended 1,600. so we want to start down at about 6 miles. That means we'll have 1,400 feet to lose on our initial descent. The minimum transition altitude is 1,600 feet, so since we'll only be descending to 2,100 feet, that won't be an issue. Now, can we lose 1,400 feet in the 4 miles from the initial approach fix to Pibza? It helps to be able to do the arithmetic in your head. 3 degrees is 318 feet per mile, so that doesn't make for very easy mental arithmetic. But 333 feet per mile is easier, because that's 1,000 feet in 3 miles. That works out at just 3.1 degrees, so it's pretty close to standard. To figure out how many miles a given number of thousands of feet will require, simply multiply the thousands of feet by 3. For a 1,400 foot descent, that would take 1.4 times 3 or 4.2 miles. But we've only got 4 miles, so we'd be leveling off in the turn. That's not ideal. Let's look at something a little steeper. The next easy number for mental arithmetic is 400 feet per mile. That works out at 3.8 degrees. At 400 feet per mile, we'd descend 1,400 in 14 divided by 4, or 3.5 miles, so that saves almost a mile. For an even steeper descent, should we need it, the next easy number is 500 feet per mile, or 4.7 degrees. In practice, use the best rate of initial descent you can manage immediately after crossing the initial approach fix. Have your speed back to approach speed before you get there. This kind of planning is vital to avoid unpleasant surprises. There are 2 altimeter corrections you need to be aware of. First, the one you use if you don't have the local altimeter setting. And second, correction for below standard temperatures. The former is simpler because the same correction applies to all minimum altitudes cited on the chart. At Pembroke, for example, if you were using the Ottawa altimeter, you'd add 160 feet to all the published minimums. What follows is going to seem pretty complicated. However, my main purpose in describing it is to show that the book method of doing things is really rather impractical. Later, I'll show you another way to skin the cat. When the airport temperature is below 0 in Canada, or -10 for some higher MDAs, every altitude on the approach must be corrected for temperature errors. These errors result because the denser air has a greater drop in pressure with height. You use the temperature correction chart from the CapGen to determine the corrections, which will be different for each altitude. Note that you use height above the altimeter source with this chart. You get the height of the source from your GPS or from the approach chart. Let's look at what's involved in converting the 2,900 foot MSA at Kirkland Lake on a -20 centigrade day. 2,900 feet is 1,700 feet above the airfield level. Interpolating between the 1,500 and 2,000 foot corrections, we get about 250 feet. So our corrected MSA is 3,150. 1 down, 6 to go. That's starting to sound like a lot of work. We'll see just how much when we look at the airborne demo, which, to avoid a long trip up to Kirkland Lake, will be done at my home airfield of Pembroke, Ontario. I hope to see you for the next section of this video. Until then, blue skies and tailwinds.